1,000 people burned to death on an excursion boat in New York City, and nobody blamed the ship's captain. On June 15, 1904, the steamship General Slocum caught fire in the East River. But here's what matters for understanding housing in America. Most of those 1,000-plus victims were women and children from one neighborhood, German immigrants living in Manhattan's Lower East Side. And their deaths didn't just vanish into history, they cracked open the entire tenement system that had been slowly suffocating New York's poorest residents for decades. Let's start with the basics. The General Slocum was a passenger steamship. Think of it like a floating apartment building. It carried excursionists, families, mostly working people who'd saved up for a day trip. The ship left a pier on the Lower East Side that morning. By afternoon, a fire started in the engine room. The captain made a decision that seems almost incomprehensible now. He didn't stop. He kept the boat moving, hoping to beach it before it sank. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Passengers tried to jump, but the life jackets, they were cork-filled, decades old, many of them rotted. Some didn't float, some people never even found them. The ship's crew wasn't trained for emergencies. There were no lifeboat drills. In less than an hour, over 1,000 people were dead. It became the deadliest disaster in New York City's history at that time. But here's where housing comes in. The victims weren't random. They were concentrated in one place, the German immigrant community on the Lower East Side. These families lived in tenements, tall, narrow buildings packed with hundreds of people. Think of it like stacking 6 apartment buildings worth of residents into the footprint of one. No running water in most units, no windows in hallways. Disease spread like fire through those buildings. Before the Slocum disaster, tenement housing in New York operated almost completely unregulated. Landlords built them to maximize profit per square foot. A family of 8 might rent 2 rooms, maybe 300 square feet total, for a paycheck that barely covered rent, food, and fuel. Children slept in shifts. Tuberculosis killed thousands annually. The city's government knew about it. They didn't care much. Immigrants couldn't vote yet. They had no political power. The Slocum fire changed that calculation. Suddenly, the German community, the same people living in those tenements, had a national tragedy attached to their name. Newspapers covered it obsessively. Photographs of bodies, lists of the dead, and the public started asking, who were these people? Where did they live? Why were they taking an excursion boat in the first place? The answer was uncomfortable for the city's politicians and wealthy residents. These families lived in tenements because that's all they could afford, and they couldn't afford better because landlords charged whatever the market would bear. A working immigrant family spent 60, sometimes 70% of their income on rent. Your paycheck today, if you spent that much on housing, you'd have almost nothing left for food. Within months of the disaster, reform movements accelerated. Housing advocates, people like Lawrence Vaylor, started documenting conditions. They took photographs, they wrote reports, they made the case that bad housing wasn't just immoral, it was economically inefficient. Disease in tenements meant lost workdays, lost productivity, lost tax revenue. They translated a human tragedy into a language politicians understood: money. In 1901, New York had passed the tenement house law, but it was weak, barely enforced. The Slocum disaster gave reformers ammunition. They pushed for stronger codes, minimum room sizes, windows in every room, fire escapes, ventilation requirements, running water, toilets inside units instead of shared outhouses in courtyards. These sound obvious now. They weren't then. They cost landlords money. Landlords fought back hard. They said regulations would make rents unaffordable. They'd have to pass costs to tenants. The poor would be priced out. Sound familiar? It's the exact argument used today in housing debates. But here's the thing, the regulations passed anyway. Because the Slocum disaster had created political will, voters demanded change. Between 1904 and 1910, New York's housing codes became the strictest in the country. Inspectors were hired. Violations meant fines. Landlords had to upgrade or sell. Did rents go up? Yes, some, but the quality of life improved dramatically. Disease rates dropped. Mortality fell. Children had rooms with windows. Families had running water. These weren't luxuries. They were basics that other developed cities already had. Here's what's crucial. This didn't happen because landlords suddenly became generous. It happened because a disaster created a political moment. The Slocum victims had families. Those families lived in the tenements. Their grief was visible, public, impossible to ignore. Politicians couldn't dodge it. That's how housing reform actually moves, not through abstract arguments about fairness, but through concrete human consequences that voters can't unsee. The Slocum disaster also exposed something about New York's economy that's still relevant. Poor neighborhoods were profitable to neglect. Tenements made landlords rich while residents stayed poor. The system was stable until it broke catastrophically. Then the math changed. Regulation became cheaper than the political cost of doing nothing. That's not morality, that's economics. Other cities watched New York. Some adopted similar codes. Others didn't and paid for it with their own crises. Chicago's housing stayed worse longer. Philadelphia lagged. Meanwhile, New York's Lower East Side, while still crowded and tough, became measurably healthier. Not perfect, better. The gap between 1904 and 1914 housing conditions is stark. The families who survived the Slocum fire, they stayed in New York. They lived in those newly regulated tenements. Their children grew up with windows, running water, and fire escapes. Some became homeowners. Some moved to better neighborhoods. The disaster that killed over 1,000 people became the pivot point that made housing in New York measurably better for millions. Today, we talk about housing crises as if they are inevitable. Supply and demand, market forces. But the Slocum story shows something else. Disasters can reset the political equation. A tragedy makes the invisible visible. Suddenly, people see the connection between where others live and whether they live at all. That's when change becomes possible. The 1904 General Slocum disaster killed over 1,000 people. It was a maritime tragedy, a failure of safety, a catastrophe. But it was also the event that forced New York City to confront how its poorest residents lived. And it proved that when disaster meets politics, housing can actually change. Not because landlords suddenly cared about human dignity, because voters demanded it. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe for more stories about how cities actually change and the hidden economics behind the places where we live. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.